Do you know why I pulled you over today?
No, officer. Could you explain the reason for the stop?
You rolled the stop sign and matched a report from this area.
Are we being detained for that, or are we free to leave?
The dashboard clock glowed 4:17 p.m. when the cruiser's lights painted the interior of the sedan red and blue, turning what was supposed to be a mundane debate over dinner into a moment that could permanently alter 3 lives. Nothing felt immediately dangerous, but the sudden silence that dropped over the car was heavy with the unspoken realization that they were no longer just 2 men on their way home. They were a situation to be managed. The rain had just stopped, leaving the asphalt of Elm Street slick and reflective under the fading afternoon light of a mid-sized Ohio town. The tires of Marcus's dark blue sedan hissed against the wet pavement as he pulled over into the parking lot of a closed hardware store. Inside the car, the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the turn signal felt unnaturally loud. Beside him sat Julian. They had been friends for over a decade, partners in a small landscaping and hardscaping business that was finally getting off the ground. Marcus, 32, was the kind of man who calculated every variable in his life. He was meticulous, usually overthinking everything from the exact mix of concrete for a patio to the exact way he dressed when meeting a client. Today, he wore a high visibility vest over a faded gray hoodie, his hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his knuckles slowly turning white. Julian, 41, leaned back in the passenger seat. He was normally the calming presence, a man who spoke in slow, measured sentences and moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of someone who spent 10 hours a day carrying stone. But right now, Julian's posture had gone entirely rigid. The rustle of the brown paper takeout bag resting on Julian's lap was the only other sound in the cabin. The smell of warm fries and grease suddenly feeling completely out of place against the rising adrenaline. In the rearview mirror, Marcus watched the silhouette of the police cruiser. The heavy thrum of the cruiser's engine vibrated through the damp air, a low frequency that seemed to settle in the chest. Through the rain-speckled glass, they could see the officer running the plates. Minutes stretched. The radio chatter from the cruiser bled through the cracked window. A burst of static, a distorted voice, and then silence. A door slammed. The sound of heavy boots crunching against loose gravel echoed in the empty lot. It was a slow, methodical approach. The officer paused at the trunk of the sedan, pressing his hand against the cold metal, leaving a palm print a standard procedure, a quiet auditory thump that told Marcus the interaction was officially beginning. Officer Thomas Miller was 28, 3 years out of the academy, and working the tail end of a double shift. He wasn't a malicious man. He was a tired one. He was operating on 4 cups of coffee and a heightened sense of alert, stemming from a morning briefing about a string of daytime burglaries in the affluent Oak Ridge neighborhood, just 2 miles up the road. The suspect vehicle was vaguely described as a dark sedan. The suspects were vaguely described as 2 men wearing work clothes. When Miller saw Marcus's sedan roll slightly past the white limit line at a 4-way stop outside a local diner, it wasn't just a traffic infraction to him, it was a match to a pattern. He didn't see 2 business owners tired after a 12-hour day of laying flagstone. He saw a dark car, 2 men in worn clothes, and a back seat cluttered with heavy canvas tool bags, stale steaks, and muddy boots. His internal narrative had already written the script before he even reached the driver's side window. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Officer Miller said, his voice projecting a forced, practiced calm. The audio of the moment was stark. The distant hum of highway traffic, the wet rustle of Miller's uniform jacket, the subtle metallic clink of his duty belt shifting as he leaned slightly forward. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Marcus kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his voice steady but slightly elevated, betraying his nervousness. "No, sir. I thought I was driving the speed limit. You rolled the stop sign back at 4th and Elm." Miller replied, his eyes instantly darting from Marcus to Julian, then sweeping over the cluttered back seat. The beam of his flashlight, though unnecessary in the daylight, clicked on, its harsh white circle illuminating the muddy boots and the heavy, zipper canvas banks, need your license, registration, and proof of insurance. Marcus moved slowly, narrating his actions to avoid any misunderstanding. My wallet is in my back right pocket. My registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for them now. The crisp sound of the glove box unlatching and the rustle of papers filled the cabin. He handed the documents through the window. Miller took them, but his posture didn't relax. He didn't look at the warning or the minor infraction anymore. His mind was connecting dots that weren't there. His training had taught him to look for incongruities, to trust his gut. But in the absence of genuine evidence, his gut was filling the blanks with unconscious bias. He saw dirt, he saw tools, he saw two men who didn't look like the residents of Oak Ridge, and he felt a spike of suspicion that he mistook for good police work. "Where are you two coming from?" Miller asked, his tone dropping half an octave, shifting from a traffic enforcer to an investigator. "We just finished a job up on Crestview Drive." Julian answered from the passenger seat. His voice even grabbed some food. "Heading home." Crestview Drive was in Oak Ridge, the neighborhood from the briefing. A subtle shift occurred in Miller's stance. He squared his shoulders. The air in the car seemed to grow thinner. Crestview. Doing what kind of work? Hardscaping. Marcus said, "We were laying a retaining wall." Miller nodded slowly, unconvinced. "Can I see your ID as well?" Passenger. Julian frowned slightly, the brown paper bag crinkling as he shifted his weight. He knew the law. He knew that in this state, a passenger in a vehicle during a routine traffic stop for a moving violation was not legally required to provide identification unless the officer had a reasonable, articulable suspicion that the passenger was involved in a crime. "Am I suspected of committing a crime?" Officer Julian asked quiet. It wasn't aggressive, but the refusal hit Officer Miller like a spark on dry kindling. "Cho Miller." Hesitation wasn't a citizen exercising a constitutional right. It was an indicator of guilt. The interaction instantly escalated from a minor procedural pause to a tense standoff. "I'm just asking for your ID to figure out who I'm talking to," Miller said, his hand resting casually, yet terrifyingly, on the radio at his chest. "I understand that, Sir," Julian replied, his heart rate accelerating, the sound of his own breathing suddenly loud in his ears. "But respectfully, if I'm not suspected of a crime, I'd prefer not to hand over my ID. My friend here is the one driving." Miller's jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle." This was the pivot. Legally, under Pennsylvania v. Mims and Maryland v. Wilson, an officer can order a driver and passenger out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop for officer safety. It is a bright line rule. But what happens next is where the boundary of the Fourth Amendment is often quietly, dangerously crossed. Marcus and Julian complied. The sound of the car doors opening, the heavy thud of their boots on the wet asphalt, in the cold wind hitting their faces, it all amplified the vulnerability of standing on the side of the road. Miller directed them to the front of his cruiser. The dash cam was recording everything. The ambient noise of the town felt miles away. Their entire universe was reduced to the space between the sedan and the police vehicle. Miller patted them down for weapons, a Terry frisk. He found nothing but cell phones, wallets, and a tape measure below. A Terry frisk is strictly for weapons to ensure officer safety, not a general exploratory search for evidence. Finding nothing, the justification for the traffic stop, the road stop sign, should have dictated the next steps. Write a citation or a warning and let them leave. But Miller didn't go to his cruiser to write a ticket. He stood in front of them, rain beginning to mist again, and pointed at the sedan. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle." Miller said, "No." Marcus said immediately, his voice trembling slightly but firm, "I don't consent to a search Miller stared at them. I've got reports of burglaries in the area you just left. You've got bags of tools in the back. You're refusing to ID yourself. He pointed at Julian. I have reasonable suspicion to believe there's stolen property in that car. But he had a hunch. He had a generalized description of a dark car and two men. He had tools that belong to a profession that literally requires tools. The Supreme Court has been clear. A hunch is not reasonable suspicion, and it certainly does not meet the higher threshold of probable cause required to search a vehicle without a warrant or consent under the automobile exception. Furthermore, in Rodriguez v. United States, the court ruled that police may not extend the length of a traffic stop to conduct an unrelated investigation without independent, reasonable, articulable suspicion. The mission of the stop was the stop sign. That mission was over. Every second they were held on the side of the road from that moment forward was an unconstitutional seizure. Sit tight, Miller commanded, keying his shoulder mic. Dispatch, I need a K9 unit to my location. For 42 minutes, Marcus and Julian stood in the freezing drizzle. 42 minutes of agonizing, humiliating silence as cars drove by, neighbors slowing down to stare. 42 minutes of Marcus wondering if his business would survive a rumor that he was arrested, of Julian staring at his worn boots, feeling the crushing weight of a system that looked at his work clothes and his skin and saw a criminal. The K9 unit eventually arrived, the dog barking wildly, scratching at the doors of the sedan. The dog didn't alert to anything because there was nothing to alert to. Frustrated, embarrassed, and entirely out of legal runway, Miller aggressively shoved Marcus's license and a written warning for the stop sign into his chest. Get out of here. Miller muttered, turning his back and walking away without another word. No apology, no acknowledgement of the line he had crossed. Just the slam of the cruiser door and the fading red and blue lights. The immediate danger was over. But the true consequences of the afternoon were just beginning to take root. 3 days later, inside the sterile, fluorescent lit office of the Oak Ridge Police Department, Chief Robert Harlan sat silently at his desk, watching the body cam footage on his monitor. Harlan was a 30-year veteran of the force, a man who built his career on community policing and rigid adherence to procedure. He was well respected, but he carried his own subtle biases, a quiet belief that his officers were always acting in good faith, that mistakes were usually just matters of miscommunication rather than systemic flaws. But as he watched the footage, a cold pit formed in his stomach. The audio of the video was damning. Harlan listened to the polite, terrified voices of Marcus and Julian. He listened to the shifting tone of Officer Miller. He saw the exact moment the stop transformed from a traffic enforcement action into an illegal detention. Harlan paused the video right when Miller called for the K9 unit. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The incident hadn't stayed quiet. Julian's wife, furious and terrified by what her husband had endured, had posted about the detention on a local community board. It caught fire. Then, a bystander who had been sitting in a parked car across the street uploaded a cell phone video. It didn't show violence, and perhaps that was why it was so insidious. It showed the mundane administrative cruelty of the system. It showed two men visibly freezing, legally detained on a whim while their dinner sat getting cold on the passenger seat. The comment section of the video was a war zone of public opinion, but the local civil rights attorneys were already circling. Harlan called Miller into his office. The young officer sat rigidly in the chair opposite the chief, looking defiant but nervous. Tell me about the Elm Street stop. Toma, Harlan said quietly. Traffic violation. Chief, roll to stop. Matched the description of the Crestview B and E suspects. They were evasive. Passenger refused to ID. I held them to investigate. Miller rattled off. Falling back on the jargon he thought shielded him. Harlan turned the monitor around. Show me the probable cause. Tom, show me the exact moment you had the legal right to hold those men for 42 minutes. Miller shifted uncomfortably. The tools, the neighborhood, the refusal to cooperate. Exercising a constitutional right is not a refusal to cooperate. Harlan snapped, his voice rising just a fraction. The acoustic dampening of the office, absorbing the anger, and tools in a car leaving a wealthy neighborhood is not a crime. It's capitalism. You saw what you wanted to see. You took a warning for a stop sign and you turned it into a Fourth Amendment violation that is going to cost this department its reputation and likely a massive settlement. I was acting on my training. We're supposed to be proactive. Miller argued, his face flushing red. You were acting on an assumption. Harlan corrected, staring directly into the young officer's eyes. Proactive policing requires facts. You had a hunch, and when they didn't bow down to your hunch, your ego took over. You used the badge to punish them for making you feel challenged. The silence in the office was deafening. The hum of the HVAC unit overhead sounded like a jet engine. Miller looked down at his hands, the initial defiance draining out of him, replaced by the terrifying realization of his own professional vulnerability. He had honestly believed he was doing the right thing in the moment. He had justified every step as it happened. That was the most terrifying part of all. He didn't know he was the villain of the story until the story was played back to him. The consequences unfolded with a slow, agonizing realism. There was no dramatic firing in the town square. Instead, there was the grinding bureaucracy of accountability. Miller was placed on administrative leave pending a formal internal affairs investigation. The local newspaper ran a front-page story on the stop, interviewing Marcus and Julian, the two men who had spent years trying to build a reputation as reliable, trustworthy contractors, now found themselves intrinsically linked to a police controversy. Some clients canceled contracts, citing the drama. Others rallied around them. The psychological toll, however, was invisible and profound. Marcus found himself gripping the steering wheel in a cold sweat every time a vehicle with a roof rack pulled out behind him. Julian, normally the stoic anchor of his family, began waking up in the middle of the night, pacing the floor, listening to the ambient sounds of his house. Unable to shake the feeling of complete powerlessness he had experienced on Elm Street, Chief Harlan was forced to stand at a podium in a crowded high school gymnasium during a town hall meeting. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he faced a frustrated, divided community. He had to publicly admit that the department had failed. He had to explain the difference between reasonable suspicion and bias to a room full of people who either felt the police were under attack or that the police were an occupying force. Harlan announced mandatory retraining on search and seizure protocols, but the words felt hollow to the people in the front row. A memo doesn't rewrite an instinct. A training seminar doesn't erase the terrifying realization that your freedom depends entirely on the mood of the person looking through your window. The story of the traffic stop on Elm Street didn't end with a neat resolution. Miller faced a lengthy suspension and a permanent mark on his record. His career trajectory forever altered. The town paid a quiet, undisclosed settlement to Marcus and Julian to avoid a federal civil rights lawsuit. The money helped the business, but it couldn't buy back the sense of security that had been stripped away on that rainy afternoon. The true cost of the incident wasn't measured in dollars or disciplinary actions. It was measured in the erosion of trust. It was measured in the split second of terror Marcus would feel for the rest of his life every time he saw red and blue lights in his rearview mirror, wondering if this was the stop that wouldn't end with a warning. When a system built to protect and serve is compromised not by villainy, but by unchecked assumptions and unchecked authority, who truly pays the price for the mistakes we refuse to see in ourselves? We are left to wonder if the line between a routine traffic stop and a violation of human dignity is as thin as an officer's unconscious bias. How many innocent people are currently standing on the side of a road, waiting in the cold for a dog to tell them they are allowed to go home?